All right, we have lesson, what, 3-16? Yep, 3-16. And this is part C. Now, again, let's just review. We have discrete data, and we have continuous data. And discrete data is exact. And continuous data is changing over time. And when we talk about what graph we use to show the data, for discrete data, we're going to use a bar graph. And for continuous data, we're going to use a line graph. Now, unfortunately, boys and girls, I cannot pause this video the way I can the others. So I'm going to just say, when it comes to something, I'm just going to, why don't you just stop the video? But I cannot pause it because every time I pause it, I have to start over, which I found out a couple times now, and it hasn't been a lot of fun. So if we were to talk about how we would graph data, let's say you make a graph showing the height of each student in a class. Is that a bar graph or is that a line graph? Well, hopefully you know that each student is exact and it's not changing over time. We're not talking about how Edwin grows over the year. It's talking about a specific at that day at that time. So that's going to be a bar graph. Whereas if we talk about your heart rate and how many beats per minute your heart is beating, and we're talking about in gym class when you're running the mile after the first lap, after the second lap, after the third lap, that's data that's going to be changing over time, because generally the more you run, the more your heart is going to beat, and it's going to beat faster and faster. So that would be a line graph, because you're going to graph it how it changes over time. If you're talking about a graph showing the temperature of water that is being brought to a boil, and you start at a certain point, and then every minute you measure, you take the temperature, it's going to be a line graph. Whereas if we're talking about what are the scores of the students on the math test, well, that's not a line graph. That's going to be a bar graph, and we would just fill in each one. Okay. So very important that we know the difference between discrete data and continuous data. And we know that we use a bar graph to display discrete data and a line graph to display continuous data. All right, now let's look at a line graph. And in this case, it is a double line graph, which is just a way to say a line graph with two lines. Double. Now, there is a triple line graph in your handout, but we're not going to get to a triple line graph just because of time. Now, if you notice, boys and girls, we have our title of our graph, which all graphs should have. We have our scale, number of bicycles. Then here on this x-axis, we have the amount of time, so January, February, March, so that's months. And then we have a key, and the blue line is comet, and the red line is tornado. So when we talk about this, and we're looking at, this is the number of comets and tornadoes sold last year. So if I'm looking for the number of comets sold in July, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to find comet, and I'm going to find July, and then I'm going to go up, and that's going to be in between 30,000 and 40,000 is that line. So that's roughly 35,000 comets. Okay? All we're going to do is find it and go whoop, whoop, to figure out. If I want to know tornadoes sold in May, and I'm just going to write tornadoes in May, and hopefully you know that's not the whipping circles. Wow, sound effects were really helping. But the ones that look like this, not that kind of tornado, but more the bike tornado, we're going to find May, and tornado is red. We're going to go all the way up, and that's going to be about 60,000 tornadoes. Now, we can also look and see the difference between two points. So if I'm looking at, I want to know the difference of sales in March between the comet and the tornado. Well, so I'm just going to write difference in March. And I can, well, we know we're going to take the tornado first because that's going to be the larger number. There's about 30,000 in March. And then the comet in March was 10,000. So the difference is, we're going to subtract, the difference is 20,000. 20,000 what? 20,000 more tornadoes. Oops, can't spell. Tornadoes were sold. Okay, so we can use this double line graph to, we can look at it just as a single line graph to see either what's the comet or the tornado, or we can look at it as a double line, as double to see the differences. We could also use it to see total sales in, let's just say, August. Okay, for the comet we had, that looks like 30,000. And the tornado in August had, looks like 60,000. So total number would be 90,000 sold in August. Okay, and one of the things that we can really look at is we can look at and say, oh, when did the sales of the comet exceed the sales of the tornado? Well, if we look right here, boys and girls, we see the blue line starting to go above the red line, but we know for sure that it happened in November. So November, more comets were sold than tornadoes. All right, now that's the end of video number 3. Video number 4 is all about practice for you, where you're going to make 2 graphs. There are 2 cutouts that we will be using, so why don't I'll stop the video and let's get ready for video number 4.